Please give a warm welcome to Tony Harris.
Thanks, Jeff. Today we're going to be talking about ethnobotany. And ethnobotany is simply the study of plants that are significant to a particular ethnic group. And in this case, it's the Cherokees. And it's a talk that I titled, If Plants Could Talk, a Cherokee Relationship. And native plants, I want to talk a little bit about native plants in the eyes of a Cherokee. The Cherokee believed in a balance in nature, living in harmony with plants and animals. They lived very close to the earth. They believed the Creator gave them their land, and it was their responsibility to take care of it and maintain it. They never harvested more than they needed. For instance, if they were going to go out and harvest some BloodRoot, they wouldn't take the whole stand. They would only take some of it because they knew they would have to go back later and get more of it for another time. Now, why are native plants or their habitat so important to animals and insects? Because they're host plants for butterflies, bees, and beneficial insects. And that's very important, more important than most people give it credit for. It's part of the ecosystem. It's what keeps things going. They're food plants for birds, and they're habitats for small animals. And we'll be talking today and touching on a few things on how the Cherokees, knowing how the plants behave during the year and how that attracted certain game, how they would use that to their advantage. Now, the Cherokees believe that the Creator provided for all their needs through nature, and it was their responsibility to discover and use that knowledge. The Cherokee were unusual in that they were monotheistic. They believed basically in one God, the Creator. And the Cherokee name for that is Unethlana, the Creator. And they believed Unethlana gave them all they needed. They just needed to discover how to use it. Now, I've identified close to 600 different plants and or trees that the Cherokees used for medicine and food, shelter, tools, weapons, ceremonial purposes prior to the Trail of Tears. And you're going to say, well, how did they learn how to make medicine out of that? That's thousands of years of trial and error in many cases. And they didn't have a CVS pharmacy or a Walgreens to go to. They had to experiment. And they had, their doctors were called medicine men. Now there's medicine men and there's medicine women. And it's not like the medicine men would take one or two plants and make a medicine or a formulary. Oftentimes it was 3, 4, or 5 different plants blended together to make a medicine. So you can see how complex that could become. That's the reason why it took anywhere from 15 to 20 years to become a competent medicine man or medicine woman. And that's also the reason why it oftentimes would run in families, because the children could pick up on it. They were exposed to it, and it would oftentimes run in families. We're talking just a little bit about changing plants into medicine. How did the Cherokees change plants into medicine? Well, one way was what they call a decoction. That's where they take plant material and place it in a large amount of water, and it's partially boiled away. They would take that water and use that as medicine afterwards. They would have a steep or an infusion. That's where the plant material is shredded and powdered and just soaked in cold water. And then there's a poultice. That's where they would take plant material and prepare it in different ways. Normally wrap it in like cloth, dampen it, and place it on the affected part of the body to be treated. And then they boiled it. The plant material was boiled for a short time in water. But more importantly, they took much of their medicine in the form of tea. Most of the time they would drink it, but sometimes they would apply it topically to the skin, and even sometimes they would take a sharp instrument, a thorn or whatever, and scratch the skins to where it would soak into the skin and become more effective. My mother practiced plant medicine on me when I was growing up. And I got to tell you, some of the stuff tastes better than others. Somebody asked me if I had any ill effects from it, and I said, nothing other than stunning my growth. The first plant I want to talk about is BloodRoot. Everybody familiar with BloodRoot? This is what it looks like. And by the way, you're going to see that I put the phonetic pronunciation Cherokee of each of these plants, so there'll be a test at the end. It's blooming right now in the Cherokee Garden. I was out there last Thursday, and we've got a huge stand of it blooming right now. The flowers are pollinated by flies and bees. Now the seeds ripen before the foliage goes dormant, and they have an organ around those seeds called elastosome. And ants love that. It's an orange coating. And when those fall onto the ground, ants will take those down into their mound. And so if you have BloodRoot growing somewhere and you have an ant pile, that's good, because the ants are going to take those seeds down there, eat the orange coating off of it. It doesn't hurt the seed. They've actually planted it in real loose soil. They take advantage of the waste from the ants for fertilizer. Then all it needs is some rainwater. And the next spring, you're going to see that your BloodRoot has colonized. Now, the roots are used as a basket and clothing dye. When you break that root open, a real dark red juice will come out. And that's what they used for the dye. Now, every color had a significance for the Cherokees. And one of the significance for red for Cherokees was it was a sign of success. And I think that's the reason why so many of the chief's clothing, so much of the artwork is in red. You see a lot of red. Red's one. I tell you, I don't know of any Cherokee that would say that red is one of their favorite colors. It's just, I think it's just inbred. Now, the roots were used for cough medicine and eye ailments. And I won't say it. It's not pink eye. But the roots were also used to treat poison ivy. They'd take that juice and rub it on poison ivy, and it would dry it up. But the tubers were also, that juice was also a very effective insect repellent. And as you can imagine, with Cherokees being out in the woods every day, concern. It likes moist, well-drained soils and part to full shade. That saquinterin is one of the ingredients that you'll find in this plant, and it is an antiseptic, and it was used cold sores, poison ivy, and even warts. Wild ginger. Now the Cherokees, oftentimes they wouldn't use one or two words to name a plant. They would use descriptive phrases. And in Cherokee, the Cherokee name for this plant translates the mule's footprint or hoof print. And the reason for that is that if a mule were to stick their foot in the mud and pull it back out, the shape left in the mud would be the same shape as the leaf on this plant. So they used descriptive phrases and every Cherokee knew what that was. It's used probably in at least 80% of every Cherokee medicinal formula. Now it's used for indigestion, mostly with form of tea, a kidney medicine, and a tonic for endurance for the upcoming harvest. Now then, you're going to say, wait a minute. As we go through this, I'm going to be talking about things like smallpox and TB and kidney medicine, high blood pressure, whatever. And you're going to say, how did they know they had that? But what you need to realize is that even today, in the Cherokee Nation, I would say 40% of the Cherokees still practice plant medicine. Some of them will go to a doctor as kind of a last resort. So it's still very, very prevalent today. Wild onion, allium, it's in the onion family. It's actually in the lily family and can be added to any food. And I'm sure some of you are probably thinking the only thing that I've ever sauteed wild onions in was Roundup. But actually, if you want to know more about it, just go Google Wild Onion Festival, Oklahoma. And you'll find it's not only the Cherokees, but other native tribes use it as well. My mother would send me out to gather this in the spring. And you got to think of it in terms of like a stronger chive. They only ate the dark green tops, none of the white. And she would chop that up and scramble it in eggs. She'd do the same thing with poke salad. While I'm out there, if I found poke, as long as it wasn't much higher than that, I would bring it in too, because poke, when it gets bigger, gets poisonous. So you got to get it while it's young. It's eaten annually by the Cherokees. And I remember in the grocery stores in the nation when I was growing up, you could go in the grocery stores and go to the produce section, and you could find clumps of wild onions like you would chives like this in the produce department. Of course, my mother would just send me out, because we had a small farm, would send me out, and I'd gather them up and bring them back in. But they used it as basically a tea, a tonic to clean the system. And you got to remove that shuck. That's all of the white part, the bottom part. You only want the dark green top. They used it to treat colic in kids, croup, hives, colds, sore throats, and liver complaints. And you know, croup and coughing. I remember when I was growing up, my mother, if I had a real bad cold, was coughing at night. I know you've gone through that yourself, and your kids probably too. She would take mint, and she would take that mint and just basically make a paste out of it, to squash it till it was a paste. Then she'd put it on the bottom of my feet, and then wrap my feet in a sock or whatever, and it stops. It stops the coughing. Now today, people will cheat and use Vicks VapoRub. But there's something about that that does kind of a cough control. It does work. It's harvested in April and May, and they actually have a wild onion festival. They even have a wild onion queen. I mean, this is a big deal. Sweet everlasting. Some people call it rabbit tobacco, Pseudodactylium obtusifolium. And here again, the Cherokee name for this plant translates ash-like. And the reason that's so is that if you take a look at the plant, the aerial parts of the plant, both the stems, the flowers, and so forth, have an ashen color. So again, they were descriptive phrases naming the plants. A tea was made from the aerial parts of the plant and was used to treat colds and flu. They would also use that before the flu season as a preventative to keep from catching the cold and flu. And they would take a cold infusion of the aerial parts of that plant and make a skin astringent. It's actually more powerful than witch hazel. So it's very effective as a skin astringent. And I don't know if you all have ever smelled this in bloom, but it's quite fragrant. We have a lot of it growing at the Cherokee Garden and Green Meadows Preserve in Cobb County. And the Cherokee, the women would clip the tops of these off when they were blooming and take them into the log cabins and use it as an air freshener. And it would last 2 or 3 months, and it's got its name, Sweet Everlasting. It grows in full sun and often found in meadows like it is in our case. The 7-bark hydrangea. This is kind of the mother of all hydrangeas. And an inner bark was used for vomiting in children, to treat vomiting in children. And a bark poultice was used. Remember, a poultice is where they take the bark and put it in a rag, dampen it, and put it on sore muscles for swollen muscles. And a poultice of the scrape bark was also used to treat burns. And the bark was chewed for stomach trouble and high blood pressure. Then a tea from the inner bark and leaves was used as a stimulant. Now it's found in moist soil under a forest canopy or close to streams. This picture was taken in our lower garden, and you can see it's in semi-shade, and it's very happy. The blossoms on this hydrangea are so delicate, white, so tiny. The blooms are so tiny, and they're so delicate. It's just beautiful. Now the stem or the bark tends to peel off in several layers during the growing season, and that's how it got its different looks, or the 7-bark name. And of course, everybody knows that arborescence simply means becoming tree-like, because with age, this plant will become kind of woody. It's actually a host plant for the emperor butterfly and a food source for migrating birds. Youpon Holly. Its name, Ilex vibatoria, is aptly used here. It was used in male-only purification processes and unity rituals. A tea was made from the leaves and stems that was known as a black drink. And a lot of times they would drink this during stomp dances or whatever, and they would drink this until they would vomit, so vomitoria. And it would cleanse the body of unwanted toxins or whatever. And it was found out later that it has one of the highest caffeine contents of any plant on earth. And so I guess you could, in a tight spot, use it as a substitute for coffee. It's very high in caffeine. The fruit was food for the black duck, grouse, quail, and wild turkey. And that knowledge was not lost on the Cherokees. They would watch, and when the fruit would get close to being ripe, where would the Cherokees be? They'd be out there with a bow and arrow, and they'd be harvesting either wild turkey or quail or even deer or grouse. So that's how they saw it as an attractant for wild game. The foliage and twigs were eaten by deer. It is sun and drought tolerant. That's why it does well in Oklahoma, a lot of both. It's a host plant for the Henry elfin butterfly. Now then, the viburnum, Mapleleaf Viburnum, a compound infusion was taken for smallpox, and this was very important because the Europeans not only brought themselves over, but they brought a lot of things that Native Americans had no immunity to or for. And one of them was smallpox. And it wasn't just the Cherokees, it was every Native tribe. It was, there was 2 major outbreaks of smallpox prior to the Trail of Tears. And each time it killed half of the living Cherokees. So it really decimated the population, smallpox did. So the Cherokees had to come up with a way to treat this. And this was one of the plants they used, because this plant, a root bark tea was taken to promote sweating. That's the first thing. It's very important. You'd want to sweat to try to get that out of your system. That tea was used to reduce fever, which is another feature of smallpox. And thirdly, it would help prevent muscle spasms, which was another. So they treated 3 different symptoms of smallpox with this one plant. And by the way, the Cherokees shared their medicinal plant knowledge with the Europeans. You know, they never called them white people, they were called Europeans. And they shared this knowledge with them. Now, the fruits bear what's known as black drupes. Does anybody know what a drupe is? No? Well, some native plants will have, their berries will be black and round. On this particular plant, the berries will be about this long and in the shape of a pear. And so they're referred to as black drupes, but that is their fruit. And the game like to eat those. It grows 3 to 6 feet tall, and it tolerates full to part shade. Now, this picture was taken in our lower garden, and this was actually planted on a bank, a slope, because this plant does not like to have wet feed. And you can tell it's very happy there. Likes medium moisture and well-drained soils. And it's a food source for birds and winter berries. The host plant for the late in the spring azure butterflies. The tulip poplar. You know, this is a huge tree. Any of you have tulip poplars on your property? They can get real big. We had 2 in our backyard, in our lower garden. And I have a picture of Kara standing in front of one with her arms out like this. And she could barely, that barely took in the diameter of the trunk, the base. They get huge. And I took one of these out to Oklahoma for it to be planted in the Cherokee Garden out there because they don't have tulip poplars. See, about 1/3 of the plants the Cherokees used back here are not readily available in Oklahoma. So when we're out there, the elders will tell me what they would like to have, and I'll find it. And when we go back out to visit family, we'll take it out there and we plant it in their garden. We're duplicating this Cherokee garden in the Cherokee Nation. And so we're providing them plants that are not easily available. One of them was tulip poplar. And so we had several. I was out there the last time I was out there. We had taken a tulip poplar out there. It was about this tall when we took it out. And oh, it was 7 or 8 foot tall now. And there's a caretaker there in the garden, and her name is Feather. And Feather, Feather and I were walking through the garden out there, and she said, you know, all these plants that you brought from Georgia are doing so well here. And I said, yeah, I know. Some of them are doing better than what they were back in Georgia. And she said, well, I just love on them. And she said, by the way, this tulip poplar doesn't have any limbs. The limbs are all in the top. And I said, yeah, that's right. And she said, well, how big does this get? Now, they planted it next to a stream that runs through the garden there. And I said, Feather, it gets real big. The ones in our backyard I know were at least 125 foot tall. And they were so tall that you didn't know that they had bloomed until you saw the blossoms on the ground around the base of the tree. And but the bees love those, by the way. They love to make honey out of that. But the leaves were used as a poultice for sores and to make an ointment to apply to inflammation. And the leaf buds was used as a salve for burns. And an infusion of the buds was used for arthritis. And the Cherokees make canoes out of this because the trunks were straight. And I'd be willing to bet you that's tulip poplar out here that you've got. that was made
Really?
out of tulip poplar. And the way they would do that is very laborious. It's called burn and scrape. And they would start scraping and then build a fire in that hole, let it burn some and then scrape that out, build another fire, let it burn some, scrape that out. But what they were doing is that they were also, as they were doing that, sealing that wood to make it waterproof. But they would make their canoes out of this often. Grow to well over 100 feet tall. It is the state tree in Tennessee. And believe it or not, it's in the magnolia family. You wouldn't think that by looking at it, but it is in the magnolia family. And is the host tree for the eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly. Eastern red cedar. We're going to shift gears a little bit. This is more spiritual in nature. The Cherokees would take the leaves and burn them, and it would create a smoke that they would use very much like you would incense to convey requests and prayers. But the elders used it for purification purposes, and the juniper oil gave it a distinct fragrance. It's actually a true, it is a juniper, not a cedar, true cedar, even though it carries that name. And believe it or not, the oldest tree that they've been able to find is in Missouri, and they estimate it to be about 795 years old. So it's a long-lived tree. And the Cherokees also made poles out of the limbs to mark hunting boundaries. And Cherokees knew if they ran across some poles made out of cedar, that was someone else's hunting territory, and they respected that. And the cones, those purple cones there, were used to make kidney medicine. Now let me tell you, we had one of these growing in our yard when I was growing up. And these thorns on these little blue cones are as sharp as metal. And you learn real quick you don't go barefooted outside around eastern red cedar, because it's sharp enough to even puncture the skin. But it's still there. Last time we drove by there, that tree was still there. Prairie willow. And prairie willow, Silex humilis, is a very special plant. The Cherokee name for this plant is red root. We have a specimen of this in the Cherokee Garden at Green Meadows Preserve. It's probably the only specimen in the entire southeastern United States. A good friend of mine is the Director of Natural Resources for the Cherokee Nation. And Pat Gwynn looked for almost 7 years out in Oklahoma before he found any. And I finally talked him out of some and brought it back here and planted it, and it's doing great. There were stories passed down by the Cherokees that this plant would walk, and the reason for that was that it had very aggressive rhizome roots. And so it could be growing here this year, but it may come up additionally over here next year. So to get from here to here, it had to walk, the plant that walks. Again, descriptive phrases. It was used in stomp ground activities, and when this was found, when they found this, it was kept very close and secretive. We were fortunate enough to have about 35 docents from the Atlanta Botanical Garden come out to the Cherokee Garden, and they had heard about it, and they wanted to come out and tour the garden. They spent a half a day with us. And This was one of the plants that they were eyeing. And so I said, would you like to have a clipping off of that, a growth? Oh, yeah, because nobody else has it. It's that rare. There's one county in Tennessee and one county in Kentucky where you might be able to find it. They made a tea from the leaves to treat fever, colds, pains, and the Cherokees did that even prior to 1700. Now you can take 3 or 4 of the leaves off of this plant, put it in your mouth and start chewing it, and you'll swear a dentist had been in there and deadened your mouth with Novocaine. It totally deadens your mouth. So they would use this for toothaches. And I want to tell you, it works. And but the Cherokees used this even prior to 1700. And then in the 1860s, there was a little German company that started studying the willow and synthesized what was naturally taking place in the plant and developed a product called aspirin. It's salicylic acid. That's why some people can't take aspirin. It's acidic on their stomach. But the Cherokees were using it correctly, and it's very, very effective. I've even tried it myself. It's a good painkiller. Now, an infusion of the bark was used to wash your hair to make your hair grow. And I had a group out touring the garden one day. Kara's still kicking me for this. And some of them were hair challenged. And so I told them, I said, now, I know how many leaves are on my plant here. But anyway, the Cherokees were using this correctly, and it's so important to recognize that they did this with thousands of years of experimentation. The bark was used as a poultice for skin ailments. You know, your better medicated skin creams today, like your CeraVe SA, that SA stands for salicylic acid. That's a 12% topical aspirin in that skin lotion. So a lot of your medicated skin lotions, if you look on the ingredients and it says salicylic acid, that's aspirin. That's what's in there. Ginseng. It's also known as mountain climber, and it's used as a pick-me-up. This was one of the few plants the Cherokees took with them on the Trail of Tears. And it was so coveted that there was actually battles and skirmishes between the Creeks and the Cherokees over ginseng. And so a poultice was made from the roots and used on boils. And a tea was made from the roots and treated headaches and cramps. And the root was chewed and blown through a wooden tube onto an area of pain. And a tea was made to stimulate the appetite in the elderly or for those with flu, colds, or infections. This has been so overhunted, and some of you may have seen documentaries on TV about the overhunting of ginseng in the Smoky Mountains, for instance. And the reason for that is today, the ginseng, the last I heard, it was going for about $1,500 a pound. So there was money in it, and they've nearly wiped it out. Now, the next plant I want to talk about is golden seal or orange root. And the reason I put these two together is that golden seal has a symbiotic relationship with ginseng. If you want to plant ginseng in your garden and you want it to thrive, and plant golden seal next to it, because ginseng is fragile and golden seal would be planted near it to keep fungal infestations away. And it actually works. Somebody was saying, I just can't get ginseng to grow in my garden. I said, well, what you need to do is plant golden seal next to it. And they tried it, and sure enough, they were able to make it work. It's used as a topical antimicrobial, and it's taken internally for digestion and as a laxative. It's used on canker sores when you gargle it. And it's used on sore eyes and also to treat TB. That's another one of those unwanted guests that the Europeans brought over, is TB. And the roots are yellow and knotted, and the stems are purple and hairy. It's actually in the buttercup family. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that Cherokee Garden in Tahlequah. Tahlequah, Oklahoma is the Cherokee capital. And that's where I went to school. I attended Cherokee schools. I graduated from the Cherokee University, Northeastern State University there in Tahlequah. And but this is a picture of the stream that's going through the garden. And this is Pat Gwynn. He's the Director of Natural Resources. And he's taken some people through the garden, explaining the garden to them. And this is Feather. And she's a hard worker. She organizes the caretaking of the garden there. And she's always excited. We drive up to, what'd you bring this time, you know? And she does a great job. It's located at the tribal complex there in Tahlequah. Has anybody been to Tahlequah? Yeah. You know where the tribal complex is? Well, it's just right next to it. There's a little stream that runs through the meadow there. And about a third of the plants that Cherokees use are not available in Oklahoma. And the elders would tell us what they wanted, and we'd take them out there. And the purpose is to preserve and promote the history and culture of the Cherokees and what they depended on for survival. There's just some of the materials that you can look at on native plants. Let me say just a little bit about that. People ask me, why are you doing this? Why are you developing these gardens? And the reason is that these plants left in the wild, Cherokees, especially younger Cherokees, could walk through the woods and walk right past them and never understand the cultural or historical significance of those plants and what it meant to the survival of the Cherokees. And I'm not willing to see that culture die or disappear. It's only one generation away from doing that. And so that's one of the reasons that we're so interested in that. At the Cherokee Garden, it's a master gardener complex project, and we have about 15 master gardeners every Thursday that come out into the Cherokee Garden and tend it. And over the last 4 years, we've had over 4,000 volunteer hours out there, and it's really coming into its own now. And we're going to have several big groups out. A lot of schools coming out now. Westminster send 80 students at a time out. Of course, we talked them into bringing 40 at a time, 2 different days, so 80's too many to try to teach in one group. But in the Cherokee Garden, the signs are kind of unique. It has a common name, the Latin name, 1 or 2 words about how the Cherokees used it, food, medicine, whatever. But more importantly, it has a 1-inch square QR code. So you on your cell phone can go to the QR store and download a free QR reader. And when you go through the garden, you can scan that, and it'll bring up a picture of the plant, and also everything I've written about the plant and everything I've written about how the Cherokees used it. So it lends itself to a self-guided docent tour, which is good because this is a passive park. There'll never be any ball diamonds or soccer fields or anything like that out there. So all you need is your cell phone, and you can come out and do a self-guided docent tour. Atlanta Botanical was really interested in that one. Now, in Oklahoma, it's a little bit different in that all the signs are in Cherokee. So if you can't read or write or speak Cherokee, there's also a small number on each sign. And there's a booklet that you can check out, and you look at plant number 24 and read about it in English. I was so happy last year the Cherokee Nation applied for and granted a $500,000 grant from the National Science Foundation to be used in with children, Cherokee children. And one of the things is that they're using this as the garden as a Cherokee language immersion program for Cherokee children. And in order to become a recipient of one of those, they have to spend 10 hours a week in the garden. So it's not a freebie. They have to get out there and work for it. But I'm so happy, and it's a 3-year grant. So I'm so happy that that they're using it for that, because the language needs to be preserved. And there's a big push in the Cherokee Nation today to get back to more agriculture. We have what's known as a Cherokee Seed Exchange out there, where I can get seeds from it because I'm a citizen, and I just got mine in for this year. And these are seeds of vegetables, basically, that the Cherokees grew back here. And they take great care to keep the purity on those seeds, especially corn, because corn is air pollinated. And that's why they recommend you never plant 2 varieties of corn any closer than about 900 feet, because the air pollination, you could cross them. They're so particular out in the Cherokee Nation that they plant them in 3 different counties, because there's 3 different types of corn they raise: the white flower corn, the yellow flower corn, and the flying eagle corn. And none of which they ate on the cob. They would leave it on the stalk until it dried, and then they would grind it real fine for flour and less fine for cornmeal. I had my great-grandmother's grinding stone that she ground corn in, but it's not in the garden. It's not going to be in the garden, no. But they lived very close to the earth and still do, and it's something that I have a passion for. And you know, I'm a firm believer that if you're truly a tribal citizen, you always give back. If someone says, well, I'm a tribal citizen, but they never give back or they take, I doubt that, because it's innate to want to give back to the tribe something that is so crucial to their culture and history. Questions? Yeah?
Very, very interesting. On your quest to locate plants, how do you find them? Like, I think you had said that Prairie Willow was very rare. How
Yeah.
did you come up?
Well, I got that from Oklahoma, from Pat Gwynn, who's the Director of Natural Resources there. I had to, I swap plants out with him. I've got things that he wants. And so I'd take him stuff, and then he'll give me stuff that I want. And so we swap out. But I was so happy to get that because it is so rare. It really is. Yeah.
Do you have trouble keeping ginseng in the garden? Do people steal it?
Well, the thing about it, I don't put ginseng out there. Even if I put a tag on it that said mountain climber, somebody would know. And it probably wouldn't last but a day or two. If somebody would have it. Yeah. Now I can do this. Put a tag up, a sign up, and there not be a plant there with a QR code. Then when they scan it, it'll bring up a picture and tell them about it. And that's the safest way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
How many acres do you have out there in your
Well, the actual,
The Dallas Highway, right?
yeah, the actual park is 120 acres.
Yeah.
But not all of that's Cherokee Garden. I mean,
You're
that,
surrounded by development though, aren't you?
about what?
Development.
Subdivision?
Well, there is a development across the street, a shopping area, and we're fortunate enough to have a new cell tower across the highway, which really helps on our QR codes and reading. We do have about 3.5 to 4 miles of hiking trails, and so it's the garden itself is probably
An acre.
acre and a half, 2 acres, but we have already about 300, over 300 plants that they use. And the way we get them, many of us are members of the Georgia Native Plant Society as well, and we have what's known as plant rescues. And developers will let us go out before they come in with bulldozers and rescue native plants. And so we worked up a good relationship with developers, and they let us do that. There are 2 or 3 nurseries that you can get native plants at, but be sure and remember, you want to go by the Latin name so you know that you're not getting a cultivar. Nearly Native in Fayetteville, Georgia, just south of Atlanta, is a good one. They have probably 500 or 600 different types of native plants down there.
Oh, Night Song Nursery.
Night Song Nursery in
right here in
Canton.
Canton.
Night Song has a good variety of native plants. The main thing is to be sure you're not getting a cultivar. Somebody else had a question. Yeah.
If we went walking out in the woods right now, how many of these plants do you think you could find?
It depends on where you're looking and where the land. I have found that land that is been wooded for a long time and preferably has some kind of a stream or water running through it is your best bet. You're going to find a lot of things there because of that water source running through it. But we just moved. I call it right size, downsize, from a 2-story with a basement to a ranch-style home, 1 step in, 1 step out. But we have a deep lot. Our lot's about 290 foot deep. And so we don't have a real big front yard or backyard, which is fine, but we have a big deck with a gazebo, and behind that we have about another 120 feet of virgin timber, and we're getting ready to go back there and search it for native plants now.
But the native plants, so many of the native plants, they're called spring ephemerals, which means they come up in the spring, and then once it gets hot, they go dormant. So right now is when the BloodRoot is coming up, and the ruinemone, and a lot of your other ones. They're just now showing up. So that, yeah.
Trillium will be coming up very soon.
What do they use trillium for? Or did they?
Well, the Cherokees use trillium for heart medicine. We made heart medicine out of it. And there's we have a very rare, Georgia says that they think they have every variety of trillium. Mm-hmm. Well, there's one they don't. It's called the Ozark trillium, Trillium ozarkea. And I got it out in Oklahoma. And the Cherokees use that for heart medicine. Yeah.
Are there plants that the Cherokees started to use for medicine after they moved to Oklahoma that are not native to the Southeast that you've?
They had some plants that they used as a substitute. The other day, last time I was out there, I mentioned yellow buckeye, and their eyes kind of glazed over. Now, out there, they have the Ohio buckeye, red, or the Texas buckeye, red, but they had no comprehension of what the yellow buckeye was. By the way, the Cherokees would fish with buckeyes. They would take the roots and pound them up and smash them and put them in a burlap sack and weight it down in the water, and it's like telephoning the fish. It doesn't kill the fish, it stuns them. And they come floating to the top, and they would net them or gig them. This is how they would harvest fish.
Don't try this yourself. If you're not native, it's illegal. So.
But this is how they fished here in Georgia. But you could also do the same thing with black walnut. You take the black husk off the walnut and shred it up, put it in a container, pour water in there and basically let it ferment, and then go out to a stream or lake where you know there's fish but not a lot of current, and dump it in there and they'll come floating to the top. And the Cherokees never wasted anything. What they didn't eat that day, they take back to their smokehouses and they smoke it for future use. But that's how that's how they, both of those are highly illegal, even in the Cherokee Nation. However, I have thought about trying to run an experiment, and she talks me out of it every time. I love to fish, but I just out of curiosity more than anything else. Yeah.
I was looking at the website for your garden a couple of weeks ago, and you said you had the sarsaparilla tree there?
Which one? I couldn't.
Sarsaparilla?
No.
Sassafras?
Sassafras, yeah.
Sassafras.
And is that, so in the information it said that the Food and Drug Administration has determined that this causes liver cancer?
Well,
So how does that work? I mean,
you mean, why didn't they?
Was there a high rate of cancer, I guess, for Cherokees? Did they use that in that?
No, not really.
Yeah.
They used it for a flavoring, so they
Yeah.
would not ingest that much of it.
Yeah, it was more of a flavoring, or like they would an herb for seasoning. Yeah. Yeah.
So how did they know they had a heart problem?
Well, like I say,
It's just a trial and error thing?
yeah. Well, if you have a heart problem, you know, you'd have signs. You know, you'd say, hey, something's not right. But on the other hand, today, even today, this medicine is still alive. And it's interesting to talk to medicine men and medicine women because they're a wealth of information, and they're very laid back. They don't walk around with a name tag, but everybody knows who they are. And they won't push themselves on you, but if you want help and you go up and ask, they'll help you. But that's thousands of years of trial and error. You know, some people think that at one time the Iroquois and the Cherokees was one tribe. And then about 10,000 years ago they broke into distinct tribes. And but at the same time, there's hundreds and thousands of years of experimentation and how to use the different medicines. And some of these plants, some of these plants are very poisonous, and it's kind of like the mayapple. Parts of the mayapple are very poisonous, but they knew trial and error which parts they could use and which parts they couldn't. Yeah.
Did the various Indian tribes share their medicine, or did they keep it fairly close within their tribe?
The Cherokees shared it with the Europeans. And people ask me, well, did all the different tribes use the same plants for the same thing? And the answer is no. Just because the Cherokees used a particular plant for a particular purpose doesn't mean that other tribes used it for the same purpose. So there's differences in there, yeah. But some of them were common too, yeah.
But the Cherokees did have extensive trading routes, even out west and north and south. So it would stand to reason, yes, they traded. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, as a kid, you learned that to fertilize the corn with fish heads and that. They put a fish in a hole and then plant the corn in that. Is that a fallacy, or did they use animal manure?
About Squanto, putting the fish in the hole. And, you know.
Oh, the fish? Yeah. And I've done this too. I've taken fish bones, chopped them up, and put them down in the bottom of tomato holes.
Right.
And it's calcium, is what it is. And the reason that the fish bones work well is that they're so small they decay fast, and the plants can absorb what they need out of that. But yeah,
They use like animal manures too?
animal manure,
Like
fish.
horse manure?
Oh, horse manure
Yeah,
as fertilizer?
yeah,
Sure.
okay.
I've shoveled a lot of that.
You want it seasoned for a year before you.
Chicken manure.
I was just curious, was your mother, you talked about your mother using plant medicines, was she officially a medicine woman, or did she just practice on you?
No, let's explain a little bit of my family history. My father, my grandfather, and my uncle were all on the DAWS, D-A-W-E-S, the DAWS rolls, which was the Federal Registry for Cherokees prior to it for Oklahoma. Now, there were many Cherokees who decided they weren't going to put their names on there, even full-blooded Cherokees, because they didn't trust the government for some reason. Now, my mother was not on the DAWS rolls, but she was half Cherokee. But that's passed down. A lot of it was just oral history and passing it down. But you knew it, you remembered it. And so it's if you were to go into a pharmacy today and you look up there on the shelves with all those medicines lined up, probably 80% of them in one form or another can be traced back some way to plants. That's why there's so much interest in that today, even down in Brazil, looking for plants that might hold a clue to help solve a problem, medical problem. So, yeah. Anybody else?
Tony's been so generous with his time. If you could please give him another round.